Chairman, and you're going to get me in trouble cutting in line in front of my
better
senior
you than
senators.
me.
Let me say it is a true honor to have the opportunity to serve on this committee, which has a long tradition of bipartisan cooperation working in the interest of this nation's national security. And I think there are few, if any, decisions that will have greater import than this committee's decision confirming or not confirming the Secretary of Defense and the potential impact on the national security of the United States. What I would like to address is my views on the merits of Chuck Hagel's nomination, and then also my views on his failure to disclose what I think are very relevant financial disclosures. On the merits, I'd like to say at the outset that my foreign policy views are considerably less hawkish than some members of this committee. I have real concerns about the United States acting as the world's policeman, and I take seriously George Washington's admonition that we beware foreign entanglements. That being said, I also agree strongly with the doctrine of peace through strength. I think the surest way to avoid military conflict is for the United States to stand strong against those who would initiate hostilities potentially against us. And Senator Hagel, although I very much respect his personal heroism and character and service, putting his life on the line defending this nation, his foreign policy views laid out over 2 decades put him, in the words of the Washington Post, no conservative publication, near the, quote, fringe of the Senate. In fact, his views in the Senate, long articulated, have consistently made him the senator who has expressed the greatest degree of antagonism to the nation of Israel of any member of this body, and the greatest degree of skepticism towards sanctions, towards any firm response to Iran, to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to those terrorist organizations that would seek to harm or to murder innocent Americans. Indeed, we saw with his nomination something truly extraordinary, which is the government of Iran formally and publicly praising the nomination of a defense secretary. I would suggest to you that, to my knowledge, that is unprecedented, to see a foreign nation like Iran publicly celebrating a nomination. And on the merits, in my view, if Chuck Hagel is confirmed, it will make military conflict in the next 4 years substantially more likely. Because in my view, Chuck Hagel's being confirmed will only encourage the nation of Iran to continue and accelerate its program to develop nuclear weapons capacity. And if that occurs, the chances are far greater that our young men and women will be sent into harm's way. I don't want to see that happen. And I think encouraging those who would do harm to this country is not ultimately in the interest of this nation. That's on the merits. I'd like to also address the procedural issues. Twice, Senator Hagel has been asked to provide additional financial disclosures. I'd like to focus in particular on one request. Senator Hagel was asked to disclose all compensation that he has received in excess of $5,000 over the past 5 years. That was a request that initially came from 6 senators. In response to that request, he flatly refused. Now, I'd like to point out that information is entirely within his control. There are no legal impediments to his disclosing the compensation he personally has received, and yet he flat out refused. The next iteration, he received a letter from 25 senators. It included every Republican member of this Armed Services Committee. It also included the minority leader and the minority whip. That letter stated that in our collective judgment, this committee should not vote, and the full Senate should not vote on his confirmation unless and until he discloses his personal financial compensation over the last 5 years. I will confess, Mr. Chairman, I was surprised by his response. I fully expected him to provide some attempt at adequate disclosure in response to that request and that very clear statement that in the absence of that disclosure, it was the judgment of a large number of senators in this body that his confirmation should not come to a vote. His letter came back, and it again flatly refused to comply. It gave no reason other than that he's not legally obligated to turn it over, and therefore he will not. I will point out that right now this committee knows absolutely nothing about the personal compensation Chuck Hagel received in 2008, in 2009, or 2010. We do not know, for example, if he received compensation for giving paid speeches at extreme or radical groups. Now, in my view, given the two letters he received, it is a fair inference to assume that he and those handling his nomination assembled that information, assembled his compensation. And the only reasonable inference, I think, is when they assembled it, there was something in there that they did not want to make public. It may be that he spoke at radical or extreme groups or anti-Israel groups and accepted financial compensation. We don't know. It may be that he received extraordinary payments from defense contractors, which I would suggest, as a matter of conflict of interest, this committee and this Senate would be interested in. We don't know what it was because he simply said, no, I will not tell you the compensation I personally have received. And I will point out on this question, I agree with Senator Harry Reid. When it came to the nomination of John Bolton, and a number of members of this body asked for additional disclosures from John Bolton, and those disclosures were not forthcoming, Harry Reid said the following: the administration's stonewalling has not only had the effect of slowing down the confirmation process, it has also put a further cloud over this individual and has, perhaps unnecessarily, raised the impression that the nominee and the White House have something to hide. I don't know if Mr. Hagel has received funds directly or indirectly from foreign sources, from extreme sources, but his refusal to provide disclosure, I think, is highly troubling, and I would suggest every member of this committee and every member of this body should stand together in at least insisting on adequate disclosure. I'll make one final point. Some have asked, would you make this same request of a Republican nominee? I'll point out to you, Chuck Hagel is a Republican. I don't know him personally, unlike many members of this committee. I simply know his record, and I can tell you this, whether this nominee were nominated by a Democrat or Republican president, I would be very interested to know, and I think the American people would be very interested to know, whether a nominee for Secretary of Defense has received substantial funds directly or indirectly from foreign nations, foreign lobbyists, foreign corporations, or foreign individuals, and I would certainly ask that of either party. And in fact, I suspect, had Mr. Hagel been nominated by a Republican president, there might be considerably more agreement on that point. So I would ask each of us just to give serious thought to our constitutional responsibility to advise and consent, and I would urge this committee and the Senate as a whole not to march ahead with such speed that there is not sufficient time to assess this nominee. Just today we discovered speeches that he had given that he had not disclosed, and it is a quite mild threshold to ask what compensation has he personally received and deposited in his personal bank account in the last 5 years. I would suggest that should be a relevant concern for every one of us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. As I mentioned before, my answer to the letter on this subject is now part of the record. On the first point that you raise, I said the following, that with regard to the demand that Senator Hagel disclose all compensation over $5,000 that he has received over the past 5 years, the standard financial disclosure form, which the committee requires all nominees to provide calls for the disclosure of all entities from which the nominee has received compensation in excess of $5,000 during the previous 2 years. Now, you may want to change the committee's questions. They're standard questions, and you can take that up at any appropriate time with the committee that you want, but it's not going to be a separate rule for Senator Hagel than it is for all the other nominees. The 2-year disclosure requirement that has been consistently applied by the committee is established in Section 102B1A of the Ethics in Government Act. It applies not only to all nominees for Senate-confirmed positions, but also to all candidates for federal elected office. My comments about your request for foreign funding are also part of the record. They go beyond, way beyond what anybody has ever requested, and I think it's not even feasible in many of the requests that you made to answer them. But the question that we do ask, in Part E of the form that we ask all nominees to fill out, is the following. During the past 10 years, have you or your spouse received any, that's during the past 10 years, have you or your spouse received any compensation from or been involved in any financial or business transactions with a foreign government or an entity controlled by a foreign government? And the answer is no. Now, you have every right to make a request beyond these requests that are required by our rules, but I don't think that we ought to deny a vote to a nominee because he wants to, or he's decided not to respond to a request which not only goes beyond our rules, but in some cases goes way beyond our rules. Finally, if you wish to modify the form that we ask nominees to fill out, that's well and good, but we're not going to do that retroactively. We're not going to single out one nominee for that. We'll either do it for all nominees, in which case you can raise this at a committee meeting on process. You'd be more than welcome to do that, but we're not going to single out one nominee for this kind of disparate treatment. Senator?
Mr. Chairman, may I give a brief response
You
to
may.
that? I would point out that these requests are not out of the ordinary, and in fact, 2 prior nominees have been asked very similar questions. When George W. Bush nominated Henry Kissinger to the 9/11 Commission, this body asked what foreign compensation had his firm received. And indeed, a number of prominent members of this body, including the majority leader, said they would oppose his confirmation until he disclosed any foreign conflicts of interest. Now, Mr. Kissinger made the decision, rather than disclose them, to withdraw, which was a reasonable decision for him to make. That's one precedent. A second precedent was the nomination of Hillary Clinton for Secretary of State. In that instance, questions were likewise raised about potential foreign funds, and Secretary Clinton did something quite admirable. She voluntarily disclosed every foreign donation to the Clinton Foundation, even though the committee rules didn't require it, because there was a reasonable question that could be raised if foreign funds had gone to that foundation. I would suggest those 2 paths are both reasonable paths to take. Number one, if reasonable questions are raised about financial conflicts of interest in a sensitive national security position of the receipt of foreign funds, one position is to say I won't make that disclosure and I will withdraw from my nomination. And I'll point out Henry Kissinger's was for an advisory board, not to be the chief civilian officer of the U.S. military, a far more important position. Or the second route is to provide disclosure enough to make clear there is not a foreign conflict of interest. Senator Hagel's response is truly unprecedented. I am not aware of any precedent where questions have been asked, is there a foreign conflict of interest, where the nominee has said, I refuse to answer your questions, and nonetheless I will not withdraw, I expect to be confirmed anyway. And I would suggest that sets a dangerous precedent. And indeed, if subsequent investigations reveal substantial financial conflicts of interest, and this Senate has proceeded with unnecessary haste and without giving due time to advise and consent on that nomination, I would suggest that each of us who did so would bear some significant part of the responsibility for that decision.
The precedent which would be set here would be by your unilaterally changing these rules that we have followed. If this nominee or any other nominee wishes to respond to your request, which goes beyond the rules, they're free to do so. But we're not going to accept a change in the rules that applies to one nominee. If you wish to change these rules, you may do so at a procedural meeting of this committee, but we are not going to accept your suggestion and innuendo that there is some kind of a conflict of interest here, because there is no evidence of a conflict of interest. He has been asked this flat-out question by our committee: have you or your spouse ever represented in any capacity, e.g., that is, employee, attorney, business, or political advisor or consultant, with or without compensation, a foreign government or an entity controlled by a foreign government? His answer is no. Now, if you have any evidence to the contrary, that's one thing. But without any evidence to the contrary, to say that you haven't gotten answers to questions which go beyond the questions that we ask every other nominee is not going to be accepted by this chairman.
Mr. Chairman, you asked for evidence to the contrary. I would point to the letter that Mr. Hagel submitted. There were 7 private funds that had paid him substantial sums of money that 25 senators asked him about, and he responded. And the question was, of those private funds that have paid you hundreds of thousands of dollars, did they receive foreign funds? He responded that for 6 of those funds, he could make the representation that the substantial fees he was paid did not directly derive from foreign sources. But for the 7th of those funds, a fund called Corsair Capital, which paid him $200,000 in the 2 years we know about, and for all we know, substantially more in the years in which he has not responded to the question, he said he could not even make that representation. He could not even say that the $200,000 he received did not come directly from a foreign government. And the question this committee asked, have you been paid directly by a foreign government, I would suggest it is every bit as relevant to know if that $200,000 that he's disclosed came from a foreign government. Now, it may be perfectly appropriate. We might conclude that it was benign, it was reasonable, but it is at a minimum relevant to know if that $200,000 that he deposited in his bank account came directly from Saudi Arabia, came directly from North Korea. Now, I have no evidence to suggest that it is or isn't, but his statement was that he could not even tell this committee that $200,000 did not come directly from a foreign government. I would suggest that it is evidence that at a minimum would suggest further inquiry is justified.